The small town of Ravenswood nestled quietly in the embrace of the surrounding hills, its streets lined with quaint cottages and cozy storefronts. Despite its modest size, Ravenswood had always been a close-knit community, where everyone knew their neighbors and life moved at a leisurely pace. But in recent months, a shadow had fallen over the town, casting a pall of fear and uncertainty over its once peaceful streets. For 15 long months, Ravenswood had been plagued by a series of mysterious disappearances, leaving the residents on edge and wary of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. Kyra stepped out of her apartment building, the sounds of the town fading into the background as she made her way through the quiet streets. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, as the evening's chill creeped through her. As she walked, Kyra couldn't shake the memory of her friend Emily, who had vanished without a trace 8 months ago. The ache of her absence weighed heavily on her heart, a constant reminder of the terror that had gripped Ravenswood. "Have you heard anything new about Emily?" Sarah asked, falling into step beside Kyra. Kyra shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, nothing," she replied, her words lost in the stillness of the night. "It's like she just disappeared into thin air." Sarah nodded sympathetically, her expression mirroring Kyra's own sense of helplessness. "It's been so long," she said softly. "I can't imagine what her family must be going through." As they continued on their way to the town hall, Kyra and Sarah fell into a somber silence, the weight of their unspoken fears hanging heavy in the air. They both knew that Ravenswood held secrets far darker than anyone could imagine, but they refused to let fear dictate their lives. Outside the town hall, the residents of Ravenswood had gathered for a candlelight vigil in honor of the missing. The mood was somber as they stood in silent solidarity, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the candles they held in their hands. The mayor took the stage, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of fear that ran through the crowd. "My fellow citizens," he began, his words echoing through the silent square. "Tonight, we gather to honor those who have been taken from us too soon. For 15 months, our town has been plagued by an unknown darkness." Kyra felt a shiver run down her spine as she listened to the mayor's words. She knew all too well the terror that had gripped Ravenswood, the fear of the unknown that lurked in the shadows. But as the mayor spoke, a sense of unity began to replace the fear that had gripped the crowd. Despite the darkness, the people of Ravenswood refused to be cowed into submission. Suddenly, as the mayor was speaking, he went silent, his eyes widening. You could see it in his face, something had spooked him. The crowd, confused, started whispering, not knowing what was going on with the mayor. Slowly the mayor raised his hand, visibly trembling, pointing his finger, gesturing to the crowd to look behind them, managing only to say one word, "Look," with a voice tinged with fear. There they were, the missing people of Ravenswood. All of them stood in the dimly lit streets, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes empty and hollow. Kyra's breath caught in her throat as she locked eyes with Emily, her friend's once vibrant smile now twisted into a mask of despair. Kyra felt a cold sweat break out on her brow as she watched the missing people draw closer, their movements jerky and unnatural. She reached out for her friends, her hands trembling as she struggled to make sense of what she was seeing. And then, as if in response to a signal only they could hear, the missing people turned their heads as one, their mouths opening impossibly wide as they emitted a guttural scream that echoed through the night air. The candles flickered and died, plunging the square into darkness as the streetlights sputtered and dimmed. A thick fog rolled in from the edges of the square, swallowing the figures of the missing people whole. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. Kyra clutched her friend's hands tightly, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed. But deep down, she knew that Ravenswood held secrets far darker than anyone could imagine, and that the nightmare was far from over. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What are they?" Kyra shook her head, her mind reeling with the memory of the missing people's hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever they are, we need to find out before it's too late." The crowd outside the town hall erupted into a cacophony of voices, each one buzzing with disbelief and fear. "Are they dead?" someone murmured, their voice trembling with uncertainty. Kyra stood among the crowd, her heart heavy with sorrow at the possibility that her friend, Emily, might be gone for good. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Sarah's hand tightly, seeking comfort in her friend's presence. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the air, causing the crowd to stiffen in fear. "Bo!" someone shouted, their voice echoing through the square. "Where is Bo?" A ripple of unease spread through the crowd as they realized that another person was missing. Bo, the owner of the small liquor store in Ravenswood, had vanished without a trace. Panic began to set in as people hurriedly made their way home, eager to get as far away from the events just transpired. "Kyra, are you coming home with me tonight?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. Kyra nodded silently, her thoughts consumed by the events that had unfolded before her eyes. She followed Sarah through the deserted streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. As they walked, fear gnawed at the edges of their minds, casting a shadow over their conversation. "What do you think happened back there?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyra shook her head, her thoughts in turmoil. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it was, it can't be good." They continued on in silence, their minds racing with unanswered questions. When they reached Sarah's apartment building, they were met with a sight that sent a shiver down their spines. A figure darted behind a parked car, disappearing into the shadows. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Kyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's go check it out," she said, her voice filled with determination. They approached the car cautiously, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then, to their relief, they saw it. Bo's dog, sitting behind the car, looking lost and forlorn. Relief washed over them as they realized the identity of the mysterious figure. "It's Bo's dog," Kyra said, her voice filled with relief. They took the dog inside the apartment, where they fed and gave it water before settling down on the couch. Over a drink of wine, they discussed the events of the evening, speculating about the fate of the missing people and what might have happened to them. "Do you think there's anything we can do?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed in concern. Kyra took a sip of wine, her mind racing with possibilities. "I think we need to call in some outside help," she said. "We need someone who specializes in the supernatural." Sarah nodded in agreement, her expression grave. "I'll start making some calls in the morning," she said. "We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." With a sense of determination, they made plans to call in a group of investigators who specialized in unnatural occurrences and disappearances. It was their best chance of unraveling the mysteries that plagued Ravenswood and finding out what had become of its missing residents. With Sarah retiring to bed, Kyra remained awake, her thoughts consumed by the events of the evening. She stood by the window, gazing out into the darkness below, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Suddenly, movement caught her eye. Down in the streets, she saw a figure swaying slowly from side to side. She squinted her eyes, trying to make out the identity of the mysterious figure. And then, in an instant, she saw her. Emily. Her missing friend stood in the street below, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights. A smile played across Emily's lips as she looked up at Kyra, her eyes blank and hollow as before outside the town hall. Before Kyra could react, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the street in a blinding flash of light. In that split second, she saw them. The missing people, following behind Emily like silent specters in the night. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, swallowed up by the darkness once more. Terrified, Kyra rushed into Sarah's bedroom, and in a hurry she jumped into Sarah's bed and hugged her tight, her mind whirled with the realization that the nightmare was far from over. Ravenswood held secrets darker than she could have ever imagined, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Morning seeped through the curtains, casting a soft glow into the room where Kyra and Sarah lay tangled in sheets, their minds still reeling from the events of the previous night. As they stirred awake and began to prepare a small breakfast, a loud banging shattered the tranquility of the morning. Sarah's neighbor, Jim, stood at the door, his face pale with urgency. "Did you hear?" he asked breathlessly. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, gesturing for him to come inside for a morning coffee. "This morning on the news," Jim began, his voice trembling. "The same thing is happening in multiple small towns around the country." Kyra's heart sank as she listened to Jim's words. She pulled out her phone and began searching online for more information, her fingers trembling with apprehension. As she scrolled through social media, she stumbled upon a post about the mayor's disappearance. His office had released a press statement, confirming the news. "What the hell is going on?" Kyra exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief and frustration. They sat down at the kitchen table, laying out all the facts they had gathered so far, which amounted to almost nothing. Kyra and Sarah explained their plan to call in the investigators they had discussed the previous night. "We can't wait any longer," Jim said, his voice firm with determination. "Let's do it now." Kyra searched online and found a nearby group of people specializing in the occult. One was a former detective, another seemed to be a wealthy individual funding the group, and the last claimed to be a medium. "It doesn't matter how crazy they sound," Sarah said, her voice filled with conviction. "We need help." The day passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. The streets grew emptier as more people decided to flee the town until the unnatural phenomenon ceased. The same day, Kyra met up with Sarah and Jim at the local bar, a refuge for those seeking solace from the encroaching darkness. The investigators arrived, and they wasted no time in explaining the events that had unfolded in Ravenswood. The investigators already knew the basics, as similar occurrences were happening all over the country. Nearly 1,000 people were missing, if not more. As they talked, a sudden burst of the light bulbs inside the bar and street lights flickering on and off startled the group. Sarah slid closer to Kyra, her eyes wide with fear. The once clear day turned darker as strange, grayish clouds began to circle the town, casting an ominous shadow over the streets. "It's time to do some research," the wealthy individual declared. "Let's head to the town's public library." "You should go home and lock your doors, and keep your phones on," the former detective advised Kyra. Outside, the chilling wind began to howl, whipping through the streets with an otherworldly force. Rain started to pour, obscuring their vision as they made their way home. They ran through the streets, the rain pelting down on them as they struggled to reach Sarah's apartment. But as they neared the building, their path was blocked by a chilling sight. Emily and some of the other missing people stood before them, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of despair. Dread filled Kyra's heart as she realized that the nightmare had followed them home. Kyra's voice pierced the night, a mixture of grief and anger echoing through the rain-soaked streets. "What do you want?" she cried out, her heart pounding in her chest. "Emily, please, come home." Emily stood before them, pale and dirt-streaked, her eyes vacant and hollow. As she raised her hand, a strange humming noise emanated from her, filling the air with an eerie vibration. Kyra's heart raced as she watched in horror, her mind reeling with fear. And then, with a suddenness that left them breathless, the humming turned into a deafening scream. Emily's mouth stretched impossibly wide, the sound reverberating through the night air like a banshee's wail. Windows shattered, glass raining down on the streets below as the force of the sound wave tore through the air. Kyra shielded her ears, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched in terror. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound ceased. Emily lowered her hand, her eyes turning from blank white to dark so horrifying, while locking onto Kyra, Sarah, and Jim with an intensity that sent a shiver down their spines. "Quick, let's run back to the bar," Jim urged, his voice urgent with fear. Without hesitation, the group turned and fled, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets as they raced towards the safety of the bar. The rain intensified, soaking them to the bone as they ran, the broken glass crunching beneath their feet. As they reached the bar, Jim swung open the door, gesturing for Kyra and Sarah to hurry inside. They stumbled through the entrance, their breath ragged and their hearts pounding in their chests. Inside, they collapsed against each other, their bodies shaking with fear and exhaustion. Tears streamed down Kyra's cheeks as she clung to Sarah, her mind whirling with the horrors they had witnessed. "What do we do now? Where do we go?" Kyra asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. But when she turned around, Jim was nowhere to be found. Panic surged through her veins as she scanned the dimly lit interior of the bar, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the rain continued to fall, obscuring their view of the streets beyond. A figure that looked like Jim stood outside, his hands pressed against his ears as if trying to block out a cacophony of sound. And then, with a suddenness that left them reeling, Jim collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing with silent screams. Kyra screamed for him, her voice lost in the chaos of the storm. Terrified and helpless, they watched as Jim was dragged away into the darkness, his cries swallowed up by the night. With tears streaming down their faces, Kyra and Sarah huddled together in the corner of the bar, seeking solace in each other's arms. Exhausted and overwhelmed, they drifted into an uneasy sleep, their dreams haunted by the echoes of despair that lingered in the air. A sharp sound shattered the fragile veil of sleep, sending Sarah and Kyra bolting upright in terror. Their eyes met, wide with fear, before they scrambled to survey their surroundings. "We must have fallen asleep," Kyra muttered, her voice trembling with unease. Sarah's gaze swept the empty bar, her heart sinking at the sight of shattered glass littering the counter. "Where's everyone?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. Kyra looked around, the dim light filtering through the windows casting long shadows across the deserted room. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. With cautious steps, Sarah and Kyra ventured out into the empty streets, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sun hung low in the sky, its feeble light struggling to pierce through the thick blanket of clouds. "That's odd," Kyra remarked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why aren't any of the street lights on?" Sarah scanned the deserted streets, her eyes narrowing in concern. "And look around, there's no light in any of the windows either." They hurried back to Sarah's apartment, their footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. As they entered the living room and flicked the light switch, nothing happened. "Why won't the lights turn on?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Kyra checked the rest of the apartment, her heart sinking at the realization that there was no electricity. "It seems like there's a power outage," she said, her voice tinged with concern. As they tried to turn on the TV, they were met with silence. "Check your phone," Sarah suggested. Kyra's hands shook as she unlocked her phone, her heart sinking at the sight of the message that greeted her. Unable to connect to the internet, it read. Before they could process the implications of their predicament, a deafening bang reverberated through the air, causing them to jump in terror. They rushed to the window, only to find that the once bright day had descended into darkness. The sun was obscured by thick clouds, and all the lights in the city had gone out. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed a flashlight, and they ventured out into the empty streets. Smoke rose in the distance, drawing them towards the source of the disturbance. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed a flashlight, her fingers fumbling with the switch as she tried to steady her nerves. "We have to do something," she said, her voice quivering with fear. "We can't just stay here and wait for something else to happen." Kyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she took a deep breath to steady herself. "You're right," she replied, her voice determined despite the unease gnawing at her insides. "Let's stick together and figure out what's happening." They stepped out into the empty streets, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope in the night. Each step they took was filled with trepidation, their senses heightened as they scanned their surroundings for any sign of danger. "What is happening?" Kyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding hearts. Sarah took Kyra's hand in hers, her grip tight with fear. "We need to find the investigators," she said, in a firm voice. "They must have some answers." They made their way to the library, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The feeling of being watched lingered in the air, sending shivers down their spines. Inside the library, they heard the faint sound of crying, their hearts sinking at the eerie sound. With cautious steps, they ventured further inside, their eyes scanning the deserted aisles. "Kyra, something feels wrong," Sarah whispered, with a trembling voice. Kyra's breath caught in her throat as she turned pale, her eyes widening in horror. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes widened in terror as she followed Kyra's gaze. There, sitting at a table, was Emily, her mouth wide open in a silent scream as tears streamed down her face. "Emily, please," Kyra whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please stop." But Emily's eyes remained blank and vacant as she stood up, her footsteps echoing in the empty library. The air grew colder with each step she took, a cold mist enveloping the room as she drew closer and closer. "Emily, stop!" Kyra cried out, her voice filled with desperation and fear as she reached out towards her friend. But Sarah grabbed Kyra's hand with a firm grip, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to go, now," Sarah urged, her voice urgent as she dragged Kyra away, their footsteps echoing through the empty library. They huddled behind a shelf of books, the darkness pressing in around them as they tried to stifle their sobs. In the silence, they could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, growing louder and more ominous with each passing moment. Kyra sank to the ground, her hands pressed tightly against her ears as she tried to block out the noise. Tears streamed down her face as she trembled with fear, the terror of their situation weighing heavily on her shoulders. In the darkness, a figure emerged, wavering and indistinct. As it drew closer, Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar silhouette. "It's Jim," she whispered, relief flooding through her at the sight of their friend. Despite his disheveled appearance, the sight of him alive brought a glimmer of hope to their desperate situation. "Are you okay?" Kyra whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Jim nodded, his expression grim. "I'll live, but we need to get out of town, now," he replied, his voice urgent. Sarah and Kyra exchanged a silent glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew they had to leave, and leave quickly, if they had any hope of surviving the horrors that lurked in the darkness. "But Jim, Emily is here," Kyra whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We have to be careful." Jim listened, his eyes narrowing in concern as he heard the approaching footsteps and the sound of books falling to the ground. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "Let's go, now." They ran through the library, their hearts pounding in their chests as they narrowly avoided Emily on their way out. Outside, Sarah pointed towards her apartment. "My car is back there, let's get it and leave," she exclaimed, her voice filled with determination. They ran faster than they had ever run before, the chilling wind whipping through their hair as they raced towards safety. But as they reached the car, their hopes were dashed when it refused to start. "Please, start, please go," Kyra pleaded, her voice filled with desperation. But Sarah's efforts were in vain, and as they looked outside the car, they saw the chilling sight of all the missing people standing before them, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of horror. "Sarah," Kyra whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm scared." Sarah turned and looked Kyra in the eyes, both full of tears. "Me too," Sarah said. Then the citizens stormed the car, overwhelming them in a wave of darkness.